guys, this is Desm101, and welcome back for another episode of Gradius Lore. This time, we're going to be talking about arguably the most well-known and popular Gradius game, and that's Gradius III. It was ported to the Super Nintendo, and it was kind of exclusive to that console for a while, compared to the other games, especially the first one, which was ported to many consoles, as you might know. It's also one of the most challenging games in the entire series, as we'll learn more about in this episode. So, let's get started. Gradius III marks a turning point in the series. This is essentially the transition into the 90s, where arcades would move towards more beat-em-ups and fighting games, big 3D graphics, and less shoot-em-ups and platformers. Konami knew they wanted a follow-up to Gradius II, and lined up a team to build what would likely be the final Gradius game, wrapping up the series in a trilogy. The game was notable for having a port on the Super Nintendo, being a release title on the system's debut here in the States, making it probably the most well-known Gradius game among many gamers. But for one reason or another, Gradius III remains somewhat controversial, and still sparks debate on the impact the game had on the series and how it shaped the image of how we think of Gradius today. In 1988, a few months after the release of Gradius II, Konami had series director Hiroyasu Machiguchi take the helm for a new Gradius game. They assembled a small core team once again, and they quickly began formulating ideas for what they wanted to see in this new iteration of the series. It was a troubled development, with pressure from Konami management to show development progress updates to the press, and also changing deadlines. This often meant rushing the schedules with crunch that kept developers stuck at the office for long periods of time. One of the designers, Takemasa Miyoshi, said this about the development. The designers have to finish before the programmers can start, and I remember our schedule being very short. On top of that, Konami was very involved in publicity efforts with game magazines, so every month we had to update them with our status reports. It was really tiring. Taking around a year to complete, it was a trying task, and they had been told it was intended to be the final Gradius game. They started with the plant stage first. One reason was to show off the early footage at an upcoming trade show to demonstrate the newer concepts like the giant plant boss pulling the Vic Viper, and the stage with tentacles of vines attaching to the craft. The difficulty became a main factor of the game, to keep players coming back for more, to see just how far they could get. Many of the staff could do quite well in shooting games, so they turned that dial up to 10 and put themselves to the test. The game could loop on forever if the player was good enough, but the developers took it upon themselves to try their very best to prevent that from happening for too long. The result is an incredibly challenging game. In fact, it was so difficult that after initial location testing, they decided to add a beginner mode that would only play the first 3 stages and then ask the player to try again in the regular mode. The Super Nintendo version actually began development in parallel with the arcade game. Takemasa Miyoshi discusses how it was during the early stages of development. Yeah, I wasn't around during the initial planning stage either. I was on the console development team, and we were talking about what to make for the newly released Super Famicom. And then we talked about porting Gradius III, which was still in development, and it was decided that it would be easier to port if I had first-hand experience with the arcade development, so I was hastily put on the arcade team. Gradius III, Densetsu Kara Shinwa E, was released December 11, 1989 in Japan, and it made a good impression out of the gate, reaching number 3 on Game Machine's list of top arcade games in the January 1990 issue. It was noted for its memorable soundtrack, challenging and unfair gameplay, as well as continuation of the sleek design and world building the series is known for. The innovative new feature this time was the ability to edit power-up options. While you could still choose from the 4 preset loadouts similar to Gradius II, now you can separately select the edit mode, which allows the player to customize the power-up selections of the Vic Viper to suit their playstyle. Certain weapon types that were not normally available would show up here, further expanding on the abilities of the Vic Viper and giving the player more strategies. The Super Famicom version would see a release by December of the following year in Japan. It showed off what the new system was capable of, and the game made a good impression on the fans. Then, finally, the Super NES version would see an August 1991 release in the United States, surprising many who would wonder if Life Force was considered Gradius II, since we never saw or heard much of that actual game. It has some differences and concessions to the original, which we will cover later in this episode. Once again, the evil dark forces gather to attack planet Gradius, taking place in the Gradian year of 6840, 122 years after the death of James Burton, whom is the original pilot of the Big Viper. Known as the Third Bacterian War, the Bacterian Central System himself leads the attack, which nearly destroys the entire Metallian system. The Gradian forces are defeated at their initial clash with the Bacterian Empire, and surrounding planets fall one after another. As a last-ditch effort, the Gradius World Force Alliance splits into two squads to defend and attack against the onslaught of dark forces, but they are defeated. Finally, the Vic Viper is called into the fray as the last hope. In the Super Nintendo manual, it gives a nice description of Bacterian as a malignant mass that has spawned all that is wicked across the galaxy. It also makes reference to the original NES manual calling Vic Viper Warp Rattler, and instead calls the ship for this game MAX, short for Modulated Artillery Exalter. One strange detail here in the instruction manual is that the levels are called terror zones and the bosses are referred to as mayors of each of the terror zones. The game kicks off in the desert stage with sand dragons and sand lions joining the usual enemies like duckers and bases. At the end of the stage is Goliath, a big bug creature that will spawn spiders to dart out at you or grab you with its large pincers. In the Super NES version of the game, there are no sand lions and the spiders are replaced by smaller alien creatures. The Bubble Zone follows up, which fills the screen with a variety of bubbles to crowd the Vic Viper, and even slow the game down with so much activity. Bubbles will also drip from the walls and sometimes enemies can spawn inside them toward the end of the stage. The boss here is Bubble Eye, a combination of a giant bubble and a golem type of creature with a vulnerable eye at the center. The third stage is Volcanic Planet, a stage that starts out reminiscent of the first level of the original Gradius, with volcanoes shooting out debris. Then the level will shake and enemies will fall from the ceiling. However, the stage then takes a turn and delves underground where the player must navigate a small maze and blast through a wall of sand before getting to the boss. The boss is Big Core MK3, the next evolution of the beloved Big Core boss type, and it looks very striking with its design and unique laser patterns. Big Core MK3 is also present in Gradius IV and V. At the fourth stage, we see a split between arcade and Super Nintendo game. The arcade features a unique high-speed level where we see the view behind the Vic Viper in a third-person scalar-type level, with no enemies and only power-up capsules and hazards. It's hardly much of a stage, and it lasts a short amount of time. The Super Nintendo game goes directly to the Moai Zone for level 4, which is the fifth stage in the arcade game. The Moai Zone is full of the usual Moai heads spitting rings, but also adds a spinning Moai that flies horizontally in the stage, further crowding it up. It can spit other Moais from its mouth to land nearby you. You will also encounter totem Moai that block your path to the boss. Next you will encounter a Dogas mini-boss fight with a giant floating Moai head with smaller rotating Moai heads around it. Then fight with Vife, a formation of 6 large Moai facing in odd directions, who will shoot smaller mini Moai that will inflate in size as they take damage. The Super Nintendo version does not have Dogas, and has Twin Vife with only 2 giant Moai heads instead. Stage 6 is the Cell Planet, with a return to the organic look and feel of the first stage of Salamander. This stage was actually cut from the Super Nintendo version. We see a return of the brain-like tentacle creatures from the original Gradius game, and the stage ends with Greygull, a variation of Golem that includes more segments of its body structure that it will use to reach out and crush you. Stage 7 is Prominence Planet, which is also the 5th stage in the Super Nintendo version. This fire stage is short but will fill the screen with fireballs that will split into 3 smaller shots if you fire upon them. The mini-boss is Wyvern, which resembles King Ghidorah, and he only shows up in the arcade version. Then you have to face Vulture Dragon, which is a 2-headed version of the Intruder from Salamander. Stage 8 in the arcade is Plant Planet, which is similarly the 6th stage in the Super Nintendo version. This is a lush-looking stage filled with green plant life, similar to themes seen in Nemesis 2. Be careful of the growing tentacles, which will reach out to grab Big Viper to get it stuck. The boss is Choking Weed, which can suck the player's ship into its flower, and it will fire additional shots from its veins. You can only hurt Choking Weed when the central portion of it is exposed, and in the arcade version, not blocked by the extra vines in front. Stage 9 in the arcade is another exclusive one, Crystal Zone, which is entirely different from the Crystal stage in Gradius II. Here you have to deal with crystal cubes launching at you as you try to stay alive against normal enemies and the likes of Option Hunter. This level is known as being one of the most cruel and difficult in the game, since there is no checkpoints and the developers intended to have the player dodge every single cube out in the open. The Lizard Core awaits you at the end, a big core type boss, with 2 arms similar to Crystal Core. Lizard Core also showed up in Nemesis 90 Kai. Stage 7 in the Super Nintendo version is the High Speed Zone, which resembles the High Speed Zone of Gradius II, instead of the odd arcade Gradius III version. The Super Nintendo gets an exclusive boss here called Beacon, who has 4 cores and will bounce shots of the cores around the screen, along with forward-firing lasers. Beacon makes a second appearance in Gradius 5. Arcade Stage 10 is the final level, Mechanical Base, which is essentially the usual base stage at the end of a Gradius game. Even for a Gradius game, this stage is brutal. First you face with a boss rush, starting with Tetran, then Covered Core, Big Core MK2, Crystal Core, Death MK2, and Dillinger Core. After this, you go through the entrance of the base, where you deal with flying panels and small mazes, where you can be blocked by defeated enemies. Moving walls will try to catch you off guard. Then you are faced with mini crab walkers, which are indestructible, as well as mounted lasers that create an incredibly narrow space for you to try and navigate. At this point is Disrupt, another version of a gunwall boss. If you can make it this far, you will then encounter Shadow Gear, with its bizarre hitboxes and geometric design. Finally, at the end is a cell area where you are chased by globes while you make it to Bacterian himself. If you are hit by an attack from Bacterian, you can actually be sent back into one of the 2 secret stages that are recreations of levels from previous Gradius games, the original Volcano stage and Bionic Germ from Salamander. In the Super Nintendo version, level 8 is Boss Rush, Death MK2, then Crystal Core, Big Core MK2, Covered Core, and Dillinger Core. And it's followed up directly by level 9 called Fortress. In this stage, you will basically face most of the same threats as in the mechanical base in the arcade version, except without rotating lasers. The bosses you will encounter are Disrupt, and a different version of Shadow Gear called MK2, which has more in common with the original Crab Walker. The Super Nintendo level 10 is called Cell, which was incorporated into the base in the arcade, but gets its own level here. It resembles a Cell stage from Salamander, and has the same version of Bacterian at the end, though there is not any secret levels present here. I should mention that the Super Nintendo version has extra bonus stages that can be accessed through secret areas throughout the game in multiple stages. When you defeat Bacterian, he will tell you
of the greediness of mankind. While men exist, so will I.
And then at this point, you will need to flee out to escape and watch out for those walls. They're a real pain to get around. Gradius III got a port on PlayStation 2 in 2000, along with Gradius IV on a single disc. It includes settings to change the wait speed, aka slowdown, to match the arcade original or to remove it altogether, or in between. You can use a level select to access stages once you beat them. It would also appear on the Gradius collection on PSP, and has been available on Arcade Archive since December 2020. So it seems Gradius games at this point were getting less ports than compared to previous games in the series. Gradius III, as we all know, was not actually to be the final game in the series, as Gradius IV would eventually come out in 1999 in Japan arcades only. At the end of the 90s, arcades were at a difficult crossroads. Traditional genres were quickly losing popularity, and gamers were becoming more involved in long-format console games. So too would the Gradius series begin to see a decline at this time, where perhaps the cracks begin to show here in Gradius III. While it's not a bad game, the difficulty veers off into the realm of punishment and misery that can put off many players of the arcade version, even on its easier difficulty settings. There is still a lot of discussion about the mechanics of the arcade game, with some notable glitchy hitboxes and bizarre deaths when Shadow Gear appears, among other odd spots here and there. In the Arcade Archives release, you can unlock a mode that allows you to see the active hitboxes and where they appear on screen. In 1997, a non-numbered Gradius game console exclusive on the PS1 in Japan was released, Gradius Gaiden, and this game really captures the spirit of the series really well, and it's a true love letter, but unfortunately it's not really well known outside of Japan. Gradius soundtrack albums and compilations started to see release in 1987 with the Gradius and Salamander soundtrack. And Gradius III got a release in 1990, which also included arranged tracks in addition to the original music. A compilation of live symphonic versions was also released in 1990, titled Symphonic Poem Gradius III, with additional tracks from other titles in the series. Even more recently, there has been a vinyl release of the soundtrack along with many of the other games in the series. The Super Nintendo version made some needed improvements to the difficulty factor, though it was still hampered by the likes of slowdown, which was common in Super Nintendo shooters. The SA1 version is an excellent update I highly recommend if you want to try the Super Nintendo game without the slowdown, which might be the best version out there for fans. If Gradius III is your favorite version on Super Nintendo, don't worry, because I think the Super Nintendo version makes a good case for why this would be true, especially for many who were introduced to the series by this game, which brought it to a much wider audience at the time. If you've made it this far into the video, I want to thank you so much for watching today. I'm really curious what your thoughts are on Gradius 3. If you've played both the arcade and the Super NES version, or one or the other, let me know what you think. And I've also included some additional analysis and notes for the end of the video if you want to stick around. I hope you have a good one, and I will see you next time. Take care.